Good morning, everyone. I'm calling the meeting to order. Please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
All right, next item on the agenda is approval of the agenda for today's meeting. I will entertain a motion to agenda. Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor of the agenda for today's meeting, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Next item is President's remarks. I'll make it brief. I said this before, I'll say it again. Kudos to the OPA staff, the general manager, the Budget and Finance Committee, and anybody else that I may have left out that helped contribute to the preparation of this budget. The process, I think, went very, very well this year, and hopefully it's used as a standard as we move forward in subsequent years to prepare the budget. So kudos to all those involved, and I thank them for their efforts and applaud them for getting us a budget that we can work with in a very reasonable and organized way. Next item on the agenda, public comments. The floor is now public comment. Seeing none, I'll close the floor for public comments and move into our only item on new business. Before I do that, just an FYI, Director Janicek should be calling in. He had a work-related issue that prevented him from attending the meeting today, so he has a valid reason for not being here, but he has shared his opinion on the budget as noted. So, and moving into the item on the agenda, a motion to approve the 2021 budget. Larry.
Be it resolved that the Board of Directors hereby approves the recommended budget for the fiscal year 2020-2021, which budget was modified following presentation to the membership at the public hearing on February 5th, 2020, in which budget reflects total revenues of $12,905,502, and operating expenses and transfers of the same amount, of basic annual assessment of $986, replacement capital expenditures of $718,019, and new capital expenditures of $167,000. Purpose and effect is to approve the operating budget for fiscal year 2021, and the background is in compliance with the bylaws. The budget process has been completed with the final recommendation of the general manager and treasurer.
Is there a second?
I'll second that.
Discussion. What?
The figure for the total revenue seems to be at one place, so I would propose putting in a friendly amendment to the right number there.
Are you willing to accept the friendly amendment?
I'll accept the friendly amendment.
Raise the friendly amendment.
So the friendly amendment is resolve that the Board of Directors hereby approves the recommended budget for fiscal year 2020, which budget was modified following presentation to the membership at the public hearing on February 5, 2020, and which budget reflects total revenues of $13,003,302 and operating expenses and transfers of the same amount, a basic annual assessment of $986 and replacement capital expenditures of $718,019 and new capital expenditures of $167,000.
Is there a second to the friendly amendment?
Second.
Discussion. So I'll open. So in essence, it's the same motion, just changing the totals a little bit with no effect on the assessment. Is that a proper way to summarize it?
It was a calculation error, and so the $13 million number is the correct number.
Any other discussion?
I have a question on the new capital expenditures of $167,000. My understanding is, as a board, we've approved for $67,000, not $167,000. So, I mean, we have not committed. We've talked about that $100,000 into the new capital fund, but we haven't talked about what it's for or anything of that sort. So, to call this an expenditure, question as to whether that's appropriate. And secondly, I would really prefer that we not do the 100,000 right now until the strategic plan is completed and we have a good, clear picture of what that money would be used for. I don't like to set money aside when we don't even have a plan for what it would be used for.
Other discussion? What?
Well, we had discussed that we're intending to approve the room on addition to the sports core pool, that there was a business case plan presented to us during the budget discussion. And the idea was that it would be in the pipeline, but the formal process for how we approve the final number, which is going to be quite a bit more than that, would be pending the work of the work group that's going to work on the new capital funding process. So I feel like we had an agreement that we were going to, that expenditure was not a formal motion.
Larry?
Yeah,
Steve, you're next.
the budget includes the new capital expenditures of $167,000, which was recommended by the Budget and Finance Committee, was reviewed when we discussed the budget and was presented to the community for community feedback. So the idea that this was not discussed or agreed to is not true. I understand that Steve, who was the only director that did not vote for the new capital reserve fund, does not want to see this operation through this fund take place. But the reality of it is we agreed, and the purpose of the new capital fund is to basically act as a savings account to put the money aside for projects. And the project that this money has been earmarked for at this point is the room for the sports course. So to say that there's no, that this money has not been put aside for any particular thing is not true also. And as Director Horn mentioned, this is just the first piece. And if we continue in the next couple budget years to put the money aside, we'll have the money to do this additional room that has been requested, recommended by the Budget and Finance Committee, and was included in the budget as being recommended by the general manager and myself.
Steve, you were next.
Yeah, first of all, I did not support the new capital fund, but have been supportive of it since casting the one vote that was opposed to it at the time. So I don't appreciate the implication, Larry, that I'm not being truthful. I don't think that's appropriate. I don't think it's a good idea to put money aside. We've had very preliminary conversations about possibly doing a pool room. I don't think the board has taken any formal position on that. And yes, we've had some conversation about it, but certainly not a formal position. So that's why I'm raising the question. I think until the board decides that, in fact, that we either identify what the projects are going to be, that we have a strategic plan in place, putting aside money and designating it towards a particular room that hasn't even been approved yet, to me is inappropriate.
Kami.
Thank you. Larry, the $167,000 is inclusive of the reserve fund, correct? $100,000 that's part of that number is in the capital reserve.
Yes, that's part of the new capital
I just
transfer.
wanted to make sure. And I think that as the liaison to the Strategic Planning Committee meeting, because that has come up and I think that we've been slow in getting that off the ground. I do have a chairman for that committee. Mo Delcher will chair that committee. Mo has now met with John Viola. We will be networking with the people from the operations side and getting that process rolling out, hopefully within the next month. But it's been very difficult to recruit members for that committee, and I felt very fortunate in getting a chairman and one other new committee members. Two of the old committee members have not expressed any interest in continuing. But we will take our responsibility in coming together to develop a strategic plan with John's input and direction for the physical plant and other things that need to be done, as well as anything else that the strategic plan might bring forth as a priority or on a longer list for the organization.
Larry?
Yeah, and that's great. I'm glad to hear that. The work group currently exists of Frank Daly, Jim Trummel, and myself. And if your chairman of your strategic planning group would like to be involved, I'd love to have him, so that for our work group to put the parameters around how we're going to manage this new capital reserve account going forward. And I think that would be pretty seamless with having that chairman involved.
Thank you. I'll invite him.
Yeah, let me comment as well. I think, especially with the conversation between Larry and Steve, with regard to the fact that I do understand and actually support the idea of not setting aside money without a plan on how to spend that, both in the short term and in the long term. I've been very vocal about my, I don't want to call it concern, just as my oversight with the fact that we're establishing a fund that absolutely needs to be controlled, needs to be monitored and managed properly. But at the same time, I will also say that I do indeed recall a presentation during both the Budget and Finance Committee meetings and our board review of the budget, where the concept of adding a room to the sports core pool was discussed, and the idea of setting aside some money this year. I think the conundrum is the fact that if we wait for a strategic plan, which I'm not saying is incorrect, I think we really do need to, we're in danger of setting a precedent that we'll probably regret, in the future. However, if we don't establish it at this point and we wait until next budget, and given the fact that we can only put $100,000 in, and I think the anticipated cost was roughly $250,000, arguably it would be 3 more years before we could do anything. And so therefore, it would elongate the timeline, I believe, unnecessarily, knowing that in concept, we agree with the notion of adding a room to the sports core pool. So I think from my perspective is I'm okay with it because we did discuss it, but we do need to take the responsibility of saying we cannot go any further with funding that account without a strategic plan in place. So I think we have to stand up and take responsibility to say, okay, we're making a little bit of an exception here, and I think it's a reasonable one given the timeline and given the previous discussions. However, going forward, we must take that responsibility and say the Strategic Planning Committee is going to be critical and, quite frankly, a requirement before we do any further funding of that particular account.
Yes, Mike.
Other discussion.
Hey, Doug.
Tom, go ahead.
Oh.
You're up. Hey,
Tom, go ahead.
I just want to put my point out here. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right, I just want to put in my 2 cents. I'm in full agreement with Steve Tuttle on this one. Without having some sort of committee that puts together a regulatory situation for this money, I don't agree with putting it in a fund and having it just sit there. We did have this discussion at the budget meeting, but I didn't think there was any confirmation that this money was going into the budget. So I just want to put that out. I agree with the budget, but I really, really think that this shouldn't go in until we have some sort of guidelines for this fund.
Thank you, Tom. Other discussion?
You are currently the
My only
person in the
comment is that we do have a committee to work on this, and we have individually and collectively expressed our commitment to setting up a workable method procedure for funding this and approving the projects for it. And I have every faith that we're going to achieve that goal. And so my inclination is to kind of vote based on my faith in the process and faith in my colleagues, basically.
Other discussion?
Yeah,
Frank?
I tend to agree with your line of reasoning, Doug, because there's a couple of things that we have to acknowledge. First, we in fact do have board direction to the general manager for creating a strategic plan, which we didn't have in the past, okay? And that's pretty well defined in resolutions that were passed at least a year ago. The truth of the matter is, if you look at this budget versus the last budget, we have had to dig through so many issues that the idea of doing that strategic planning, which was to be incorporated in the plan that the GM was going to give us, it hasn't fallen by the wayside because there are elements of it there. It's just not the completed process. It's like we have the building blocks there but haven't connected them, okay? And that's because, quite frankly, we've been working on so many other problems that we had to dig out of. So as a person, look, I mean, I was a homeowner and decided to get involved because we were collecting money and didn't have a plan. Okay, so I understand where Steve's coming from, but I also see the differences because we have discussed it. We do know what this money is going toward, whereas in the past, we were collecting money and there were documents out there showing a $10 million facility that nobody agreed with. And we're way past that. We have a specific focus on this. We have a specific process. And just going through this budget process and seeing where we're at and seeing that the Strategic Planning Committee is coming back to enforce and put the board regulations in place gives me a level of comfort that, yeah, there's a risk, but it's a reasonable risk to take.
Other discussion? Steve?
Yeah, I want you to understand, I'm not opposed to the new capital fund. What I am opposed to is saying that we're going to put $100,000 for a pool addition when the strategic plan committee hasn't met, the work group hasn't met. What if the strategic plan committee comes up and says, you know what, there's a higher priority here, we need to do something different than to spend $100,000 or $250,000 for a pool addition? And we're kind of locking ourselves into something with the wording, the way it's presented, that we have to spend that money on a pool room addition. I don't think we've approved that yet.
It's just a point. I believe in that original resolution, the finance resolutions, that the board has the ability to reverse that transfer.
Stand by. Larry?
Yeah, the reality of it is, this is a planning tool, a financial planning tool. Nothing can be spent until 4 directors agree to spend the money. This is basically a savings account. And if the same 4 directors at some point say, hey, we've changed our mind, we don't want to build the room, then we have the option of either moving the money back into the replacement reserve account by a 4 director vote, or leaving it in there and, seeing if another project develops. So, I mean, we can't spend it until the board agrees to specifically spend the money. And if the board at some point decides, no, we're not going to do this, the money can be moved back to replacement reserves.
Yeah, my comment is this is the exact situation that I had talked about when we first brought up the idea of this new capital fund. I used jokingly the bowling alley reference, but this is the exact same situation where if we earmark it in one fiscal year and build a budget that moves money from the reserve account to this new capital fund, then we've sort of committed to spending it that way. And if we don't, yes, I would agree. And the majority of the board could reevaluate the original intent of that funding based on new information. We're on I wouldn't call it a slippery slope. I just think that based on it, you know me, I was kind of in between on this only because there's no absolute controls over it. And I think by design, I'm not sure we're able to get an absolute control over it. Steve, I agree with you 100%. I don't like going in there blind with just putting money away, because one could argue that, well, wait a minute, why is the association collecting money out of my pocket that I could be earning interest on, that they're earning interest on it? You're basically taking money out of my pocket and putting it in yours without spending it on anything specific. Okay, well, that's got to happen to a certain extent anyway. But I just believe that given this current situation, and again, it's the first year too. That's the other part of it. This is our initial foray into taking what we decided as the creation of a capital budget, or new capital budget fund, and actually turning it into something tangible and actionable based on the budget and then the operation based on that budget for the upcoming year. So I think we owe it to ourselves to both, A, stay with the original intent of it and put it out there, and B, closely monitor exactly what it is that we're going to do going forward, because I would agree, Steve, it's very good that, the Strategic Planning Committee could come up and reprioritize something based on a new condition. But you know what? I would argue, people, that happens all the time. We can't predict the future. Something may come up that causes us a huge insurance expense that we hadn't planned on. All right, so we can only predict as far as we can, predict knowing what we know. It's the unknown that we have to deal with. We have to be prepared to have the flexibility to deal with. So all the arguments are valid. I like them. I'm glad we interact in this way. I just believe that I think we're okay. No, I firmly believe we're okay. But again, as I stated earlier, we can't just sweep this under the rug and say, okay, that issue's over. We need to continue to monitor this situation closely. And I would, urge my colleagues to continue to provide input, feedback as we go through this process this year and really look at it. I'm quite frankly encouraged that we're going to have a strategic planning committee, and quite frankly looking forward to some of the feedback that might influence the way we think about things going forward, knowing that we're making a decision on funding this new capital fund with $100,000 earmarked for a sports core pool room, and seeing if that changes over time. But I'm fine with it. Again, arguments are both valid. I'm glad we brought this up. I'm comfortable with the budget the way it's presented right now, and would continue any further discussions. Cammie.
Just to summarize then, we have $100,000 in capital reserve fund, which may or may not be earmarked for a sports core pool room, depending on the votes of at least 4 of us. Is that correct, Larry?
Well, no, it's, at this point, that $100,000 is earmarked for the room.
For the pool, yes.
Okay.
But it can't be spent until a vote of 4 directors say, yes, we can spend it.
All right.
And that's when we get to the project phase.
Right, I just wanted to clarify that point. And so, as directors, we are waiting for the reports of the Strategic Planning Committee and bringing a strategic plan forth to the Board of Directors for their vote, for their consideration, and eventually a vote that will help us prioritize where we're headed strategically in maintenance of the physical properties and additional amenities, if any, to the association. Would that be a correct statement? All right, thank you.
Yeah, I think, and Cammie, to follow up on that, you're going to get feedback from the Strategic Planning Committee, the general manager based on operations, and other board members. So you got 3 different entities that are all going to contribute to the discussion and eventual decision by the board on any particular issue.
Thank you.
Other discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the question on the friendly amendment. All those in favor of the friendly amendment as presented, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right. Now, did we get a?
That was an aye. That was an aye, right, Tom?
Yeah, Tom voted yes, so it's unanimous. All right, now we'll move back to the original motion as amended. Any further discussion on the original motion as amended by the friendly amendment? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor of the original motion as amended by the friendly amendment, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Abstentions? One abstain. All right. The motion passes, and the budget will be adopted as presented. I want to thank everyone. There are no more items on our agenda for today's meeting, so I'll entertain a motion for adjournment.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor? Aye. Thank you, everyone.